Respected Professor Srikala Iyer, Patron of the GFYP, respected Chair of this session, Dr. Kanjana Mahadevan, Professor of Philosophy, University of Mumbai, today's young scholar, Mr. Bharatwaj Iyer, and dear friends, good evening to all. I'm so happy to stand before you to welcome all of you to this monthly study circle of the Global Forum for Young Philosophers. My duty is to introduce and welcome today's chief guest, to introduce the theme and the young scholar who present his scholarly ideas. First of all, I introduce Dr. Kanjana Mahadevan, an accomplished philosopher and senior scholar. Actually, we are honored to have such a great scholar with us in this evening as the chairman of the today's session. She is currently the head of the Department of Philosophy, University of Mumbai. She received her doctoral degree on 1993 in philosophy from University of Georgia, USA, with a doctoral research focused on Habermas' theory of communicative action. She is a great scholar, and her areas of specialization includes political philosophy, continental philosophy, feminist philosophy, especially for care ethics and ethics, etc. And she is also competent with the prominent areas like analytic philosophy, contemporary Indian philosophy, epistemology, etc. And she is also focused on many interdisciplinary areas such as aesthetics, research methodology, diaspora studies, environmental ethics, gender studies, philosophy of film and culture studies, and etc. etc. She has numerous national and international level publications and paper presentations during her academic career. And during her academic career, he received so many honors and awards, including various scholarships and prizes. Dr. Kanjana Mahadevan's contribution to philosophy and academia has been significant, and her expertise spans various philosophical domains. Her research, teaching, and commitment to interdisciplinary studies make her a respected figure in this field. It is my privilege to welcome Dr. Kanjana Mahadevan to this humble event. On behalf of Global Forum for Young Philosophers and on behalf of all who participating in this event, I extend a warm welcome to you, ma'am. Then I would like to welcome our beloved patron, Dr. Srikala Iyer. There is no need of any introduction to Srikala ma'am in this philosophy fraternity in India. She is now the Honorable Director of the International School of Sri Shankaracharya Studies, Sri Shankara University of Sanskrit. She is actually the backbone of this prestigious forum, and her initiatives to encourage the young scholars is a commendable thing. On behalf of all those who gathered here, I extend a hearty welcome to you, ma'am. I also like to welcome the young scholar of the day, Mr. Bharatwaj Iyer, who is going to present a paper in this session. Bharatwaj Iyer is a PhD student in the Humanities and Social Science Department at the Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay. His research work focused on Martin Heidegger's account of the history of Western metaphysics and its relation to other traditions of thought. He received his MA in philosophy from the University of Mumbai. He currently serves as an assistant editor at Mumbai University Interdisciplinary Journal dedicated to social justice called Sambhashana. I am so happy to welcome him on behalf of Global Forum for Young Philosophy and on behalf of all those who joined the session. I welcome Mr. Bharatwaj Iyer to such a prominent event. So, senior scholars and some senior scholars and teachers are also with us in this evening to share their ideas and scholarly thoughts. I would like to extend our hearty welcome to all of them. I would also like to welcome all of you for attending this event. I hope that you found it informative and enjoyable. Thank you and have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
May I now
Yeah.
invite Professor Kanchana Mahadevan, the chair of today's session, to introduce the theme of today's session. Over to you, ma'am.
At the outset, I wish to put forth my thanks to Professor Bala Murli, to Professor Srikala Nair, and to Dr. Shimi and everyone else who has been responsible for this event. It's a great idea to have a forum of young thinkers, and it is particularly lacking, I think, in our context. And it's wonderful to have this platform where they can present their views. Excuse me, I have a slightly bad throat, and where we can listen to one and to them as well and have a good conversation. So I thank you for this forum, and I thank you for this opportunity to share this session. um, I see several here on the screen whom I know, and like Miss Nirmala, Mr. Yash Agarwal. So it is wonderful that we are all here again together to discuss Heidegger after so many years. And I am particularly looking forward to this session because Mr. Bharatwaj Iyer has been a very, very motivated student who has been publishing right from the time of his MA period. He's one of those rare students who published on his own and who published extensively in international journals, in national journals, and so forth. And I think this will surely be an inspiration to everyone else. And besides, just I would like to add a word that as a student in the various classes where we have interacted during MA, he always brought up texts and he brought them up after very careful readings. And this is something he always reminded us in the classroom, the importance of reading texts very carefully and very closely. And I think this session will be very, very important because of this. And it is also important because of the topic that he has chosen. His abstract mentions that he will be discussing the idea of metaphysics, that the reconstruction of metaphysics that Heidegger gives us, with particular reference to his essay, The Age of the World Picture, where the idea of metaphysics is grounded, supposedly grounded, I mean, that's a strong word to use here, on the idea of a failure in the sense of not providing absolute foundations and so forth. So it'll be very interesting to listen to what he has to say, particularly in the context of Heidegger's critique of traditional metaphysics, right from the time of the Greek period and Plato till the time of Sartre and positivism, as being grounded in a certainty where there is a certain taken for grantedness of a foundation that is determinate, that is concrete, that is specific. And it has tried to provide a home, but it has led to a certain homelessness. It has imagined that it is giving a certain growth to the human being, whereas with its anthropocentrism, it has led to what he terms as a devolution or a descent, in a way, of the human self itself. So, in what way can we rethink metaphysics to bring out relationship that is more creative, a metaphysics that just does justice to ontology in the truly Aristotelian sense, perhaps. So let's see, maybe Mr. Iyer will throw light on this. So I invite Mr. Iyer to make his presentation, and he will speak for about an hour, is it?
Around 45 minutes, 50
Okay.
minutes.
Okay, thank you. So 50 minutes, so it's 6:11 now. So you can speak until 7:01. I'll send you a text message.
Sure.
Reminding you of the time. Or maybe I'll put it on the chat box here, if that is okay with everyone. Yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your kind words and for that excellent summary as well. I mean, there's so well encapsulates uh, so many of my concerns in this paper. I would like to begin by thanking all the senior professors and senior scholars here, Dr. Balamurali, Dr. Shrikala Nair, and also Ramya, who coordinated with me for setting this event up, and all the labor that has gone into it. I wish to begin with a word of gratitude for that. And I'm also extremely grateful for the opportunity and for the space. And I also wish to begin by thanking all members of the audience who are currently present. So I'll begin by sharing my paper. So I'll be reading out my paper, and I mean, it's so I'll begin by reading out the paper, and also the sort of the progressive steps and stages of the argument. So the question of failure in metaphysics is a slightly unlooked at feature in Heidegger scholarship, although it is very prominent and prevalent throughout Heidegger's corpus. So, okay, so I'll share my paper and we can begin. Is the paper visible?
Yes, yes, it is.
Okay, I've slightly changed my title. So I'm calling my title "Failure as Resistance" in Heidegger's account of the history of metaphysics, and so I begin. So in this paper, I take the notion of failure as the essential constitutive feature of metaphysics for Heidegger, as an important doorway to understanding the project of Heidegger's later thinking. So far, studies have not paid sufficient attention to the importance of failure in the late Heidegger. However, we should keep in mind that failure here is not just meant in the negative sense as a defect or incapacity, as for instance, when we fail an exam or when Heidegger fails to accomplish his project in Being and Time. To put it simply, failure is analyzed as a liberating phenomenon, implying resistance to being completely totalized and mastered by a system of thought or plan of action. Failure indicates otherwise possibilities. As we shall see below, our protagonist for the evening, failure, functions like Agamben's notion of potentiality in his reading of Aristotle. For Agamben, potentiality refers to the positive ability or capacity to not be. In our reading, it is the ability to not be drawn into the full light of actuality and to instead reside agonistically and resistantly at the borders and margins of a structure of intelligibility. Heidegger's notion of failure performs a similar function. In her article entitled Heidegger and Stiegler on Failure in Technology, Ruth Irving writes, failure is crucial to Heidegger's concept of epistemology, aletheia, where the truth becomes apparent where once it was hidden from view. I don't accept Irving's characterization of aletheia as Heidegger's concept of epistemology, given that Heidegger's project is a thinking of the prior historical conditions of all epistemologies. Nor do I take the exact route that Irving does in her paper. However, I do agree with Irving that failure is crucial to Heidegger's conception of truth as unconcealment. In our analysis, failure is crucial to the very history of truth, as it variously manifests in the history of being. As already stated, failure has received little attention so far in Heidegger scholarship. Michael Marder points out in his paper, Heidegger's Phenomenology of Failure in Sein und Zeit in Being and Time, that as soon as they take up the subject of failure, commentators cannot resist the temptation to convert it without hesitation into the failure, or rather the failures, of Heidegger. Unlike these commentators, whose texts have value in their own right, our focus is not on Heidegger's moral failures or the failures of his projects of thinking and writing. These are certainly crucial matters, but several studies have already been dedicated to these topics. Our focus instead is to locate failure at the heart of being itself, and as the very condition of all historicity. Our focus is to draw this out from Heidegger's texts. As we move forward, the paper will attempt to introduce certain elementary terms in Heidegger's history of Western metaphysics, or his account of the history of Western metaphysics. And failure, I promise, is an important prism through which the project of Heidegger's thinking can both be introduced and critically evaluated. With these insufficient remarks, let us move to the argument of the paper, which, as I was saying at the beginning, goes in stages. So, and the one thing I want to say is that in the beginning, Heidegger's pronouncement would sound a little perplexing or a little bizarre, but he also provides the sort of logic that he's working with. So bear with him as the argument progresses. So the first section. Martin Heidegger's central project throughout his lifetime of thinking is raising the question concerning the meaning of being, Seinsfrage. This question, according to him, has been perpetually forgotten in the history of Western metaphysics. Moreover, Heidegger claims that metaphysics is precisely the failure to raise this question concerning being. In his notebooks that he kept between 1936 to 1941, titled Mindfulness or Besinnung, Heidegger states tersely that metaphysics owes its permanence to the failure to raise the question of being. Paradoxically, the success of metaphysics as an enterprise depends on this failure. This failure is a structural element of metaphysics and is not simply the fault of this or that metaphysician. In the 1949 introduction to his 1930 lecture, What is Metaphysics?, Heidegger claims, first, that the truth of being has remained concealed from metaphysics during its long history from Anaximander to Nietzsche. He then asks why this is so. He states that metaphysics fails to think about the truth of being not due to a mere negligence of thought or a carelessness of expression. Rather, being itself, which is the ground on which metaphysics stands, perpetually withdraws from being questioned by metaphysics. As he puts it rhetorically, or does it belong to the essential destiny of metaphysics that its own ground withdraws from it? So far, we learn that the failure to question about being is itself the withdrawal of being. And this withdrawal of being constitutes an essential structure of metaphysics. So after saying this as an introduction, we then asks, what, however, for Heidegger is being or Sein? We cannot answer this question so soon, but suffice it to say that a negative definition of being from his magnum opus, as it were, Being and Time, states, the being of entity is not itself an entity. And in a lecture he gives in the same year, called The Basic Problems of Phenomenology, he terms this as the ontological difference, which he characterizes as the differentiation between being, Sein, and beings. This ontological difference, which is, he clarifies, which is not merely between one being and another being, but between being, Sein, and beings, Seiende, is what metaphysics perpetually fails to think about. This appears at first sight like a bizarre claim. It is bizarre because metaphysics, since Aristotle, incessantly studies nothing but being. For instance, in Book 4 of his Metaphysics, Aristotle defines metaphysics as the study of being qua being. However, our unconvinced, even unsettled reaction to the proposition that metaphysics is a long history of Seinsvergessenheit, forgetfulness about being, that this sort of unconvinced reaction is anticipated by Heidegger from the very introduction to Being and Time. He states there that though the history of ontology has constantly focused on being, it has nevertheless reduced being to a universal, self-evident, and conceptually empty category, rid of all its ambiguity, mystery, and perplexity. As we follow Heidegger's analysis through his career, we learn that the precise failure of metaphysics, which we must remember is also its defining feature, is in its failure to deconstruct the genealogy of its presupposed, that is, always already forgotten and received understanding of the being of entities. As will progressively become clearer, this understanding that metaphysics inconspicuously takes over, this pre-understanding that metaphysics inconspicuously takes over, owes itself to the clearing or opening that being already provides or being already allows. So there is something that is happening before metaphysics thinks about being, which determines the way it thinks about beings, which metaphysics itself perpetually fails to think about. So in the 1949 introduction to What is Metaphysics, which we have quoted, he states, metaphysics thinks beings as beings. Wherever the question is asked what beings are, beings as such are in sight. Metaphysical representation owes this sight to the light or clearing of being. However, this light itself, that which such thinking experiences as light, no longer comes within the range of metaphysical thinking. For metaphysics always represents beings only as beings. What Heidegger is saying here is that although metaphysics perennially claims to be thinking about being, it is only thinking about being in terms of beings or entities. In other places, Heidegger calls this metaphysical thinking of being as the thinking about the beingness of beings. And beingness, Seiendheit, in Heidegger's vocabulary, asks the ultimate whatness of entities, but fails to ask about the prior conditions that lead to thinking of whatness in certain terms rather than other terms. Derrida, in his 1964-65 seminars on Heidegger, the question of being and history, states that traditional ontology, and this is an excellent summary of the critique that Heidegger is making, that traditional ontology does not pose the question of the being of beings as a question of the very being of this beingness. So it does not go that one step behind. In other words, the historical provenance, the historical decisions that lead to this or that ground as answering the whatness of beings is left out of consideration by metaphysics. For instance, if Thomas Aquinas considers the whatness of contingent beings as ultimately grounded and answered in God as necessary being, the reason why the beingness of beings or the whatness of beings is considered in terms of a necessary being at all is itself unquestioned by, in this case, Thomist metaphysics. Unquestioned because it takes it to be logically self-evident and therefore stops short of asking the conditions of this very self-evidence. In Derrida's terms, failing to think the ontological difference means failing to ask what comes before the question. What already determines the what? What is it that already opens the very space for raising the question? What is it that already determines how the what should be asked and who can ask this and who can answer this? Right? We go to the footnote. For instance, when a thinker like Descartes is analyzing the human body, whose body is the subject of inquiry here? What body is assumed as the self-evidently natural body? Is it the male body or the female body? And speaking of the Indian context, is it the Dalit body or the Savarna body? What are the historical preconditions that determine the naturalness of these choices? When metaphysics fails, it both fails to see its own blind spots and also fails to master and preempt these loopholes. On the other hand, the danger of technology for Heidegger, technology as a mode of revealing for Heidegger, is precisely this omniscience, this anxiety to overcome failure, this all-pervading light that allows no concealed possibilities to remain. We are still not clear as to what Heidegger has in mind. So let us quote him again from the same essay. In whatever manner beings are interpreted, whether as spirit after the fashion of spiritualism, or as matter and force after the fashion of materialism, or as becoming and life, or as representation, will, substance, subject, or energeia, or as eternal recurrence of the same, as in Nietzsche, every time beings as beings appear in the light of being. Wherever metaphysics represents beings, being has already been cleared. Being has already arrived in the state of unconcealedness, aletheia. How being has already unconcealed itself as a particular ground as a particular way of grounding the whatness of beings in terms of God or matter or substance or will to power is what metaphysics must necessarily fail to see if it is to remain metaphysics. In insisting on this failure, Heidegger continues, metaphysics means beings as a whole, although it speaks of being. It names being, but means beings as beings. Furthermore, insofar as thinking sets out to experience the ground of metaphysics, insofar as thinking attempts to recall the truth of being itself, thinking has, in a sense, left metaphysics. What this last passage means is that for thinking to be metaphysical, it must necessarily fail to think about beings as such, to think about being as such, what he calls sein selbst. It is this that Heidegger means in that quotation from Mindfulness, which goes, metaphysics owes its permanence to the failure to raise the question of being. However, a question may here be asked, and it is in fact a current debate in Heidegger scholarship. Does all metaphysics fail to raise this question? Do even supposedly radical metaphysicians like Bergson or Whitehead, or if you will, Heidegger himself, fail? I'm going to the footnote. My answer is yes, it always fails. However, to understand this position, which some Heidegger scholars like Richard Capobianco and James Filler deny, one needs to understand what Heidegger means by metaphysics and its cognitive and normative functions, which we will look at in the next section. Secondly, one also needs to understand that the question hides a certain misgiving about failure itself, as though it were a negative thing. In fact, from a strictly Heideggerian position, it is precisely when metaphysics maintains this element of failure, this chink in its armor, as it were, it is only then that it is truly liberatory. To unravel these conundrums, we need to understand two central terms, being and metaphysics. In my research, I understand Heidegger's understanding of metaphysics through his account of the ontotheological constitution of metaphysics, and it is to this that we now turn. The structure of metaphysics is ontotheology. We begin with the term metaphysics. For Heidegger, the term metaphysics is a much broader concept than usually understood. In his 1938 essay entitled The Age of the World Picture, Heidegger states, metaphysics grounds an age in that through a particular interpretation of beings and through a particular interpretation of truth, it provides an age with the ground of its essential shape. This grounding of the shape of an epoch, I have argued in my research, involves not just the cognitive aspects involving truth and falsity, etc., but involves also the normative and legal dimensions that structure a world in which Dasein, or the human being, can immerse itself. Metaphysics grounds a structure of intelligibility in a way that things and practices do not perpetually scream for meaning from Dasein. How does metaphysics do this? We have already seen Aristotle's definition from Book 4 that defines metaphysics as the study of the sheer being of entities, of the principles that account for the being of entities. For Aristotle in Book 4, metaphysics becomes etiology, the study of the fourfold causal principles of beings or entities. Further, in Book 12, the book Lambda of the Metaphysics, Aristotle leads us to think from these causal principles to the prime cause or the prime mover, which is equally the subject of metaphysics. So metaphysics is studying both the ontological structure of beings and the prime principle, which is the theological element, which is God. Similarly, for medieval commentators like Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, metaphysics both studies the universal nature of being and the primary principle of God. Taking one example, Al-Farabi in his Aims of Aristotle's Metaphysics states that metaphysics studies something common to all existent beings, like existence, unity, and so on, and simultaneously the principle common to all existent beings, namely the thing that should be called God. Why should the study of God be included with the study of the common features of existence? He states, theology should fall under this science because God is a principle of the existent in the absolute sense. God is both the reason for why there is something at all rather than nothing, and he is also the exemplary and absolute kind of existent, or what Leibniz called ens perfectissimum, the most perfect being. So God is both so metaphysics studies both the basic structure of entities and the preeminent entity, which is God. Aristotle and his two commentators provide a good description of what metaphysics is and does, a classical description. There is a reason why I have chosen two medieval commentators of Aristotle, because if I were to ask you to define metaphysics, you will define it as ontology, as a study of being and its features, but you would reserve the theological side of that description only to the medieval age, only to the scholastics. However, what Heidegger insists is that metaphysics from Anaximander to Nietzsche always remains both an ontology and a theology. However, what theology means will be different, and Heidegger will re-describe that. Not because either Anaximander or Nietzsche subscribe to the belief in a personal God of theism, but because Heidegger thinks of metaphysics as constitutively ontotheological, which means engaged simultaneously both in the shared or general features of entities and the most perfect instance of entities. Now we go to Heidegger's essay. His 1957 essay, The Ontotheological Constitution of Metaphysics, defines metaphysics in this way as an answer to his more preliminary question, how does the deity enter into metaphysics? Metaphysics, he says, thinks of the being of beings both in the ground-giving unity of what is most general, what is shared, what is indifferently valid everywhere, and also in the unity of the all that accounts for that ground, that is, the all highest. So let's unpack this. Metaphysics is ontotheological because it stabilizes and secures a constellation of meaning or intelligibility by providing an ontological bedrock and fundamental sense of reality to which the whole structure of intelligibility can be reduced. As an example of this, in the case of Thales, the ontological foundation to which the meaning of entities and their relations is reduced is water. For modern science, on the other hand, it is quantitative measurability. That's to which all of reality could be reduced. However, how does metaphysics do this reductionism, as it were? However, metaphysics does all this through the limit and demarcation that is set in place by the paradigmatic case, the all highest, which Heidegger also calls the deity. So metaphysics does this by delimiting and contouring a certain ontological substructure through a paradigmatic instance of entities. Ian Thompson calls this ontotheological structure of metaphysics its two-chambered heart, which he thinks is emblematized, for instance, in Plato's theory of form, where the ontological foundation of reality and the exemplary or paradigmatic instance of reality are one and the same. But we still need to understand this further, and we'll come to failure after this. Let us better understand this by considering and developing van der Heyden's interesting example from sports in his exploration of ontotheology. But we will be doing it differently. How does one access the general rules and boundaries of a game like cricket? A paradigmatic player, the deity, the paradigmatic player like Tendulkar or Bradman becomes a point of access to understanding the range of possibilities that contour the game. This is how the game shows itself to our assessment. The game itself, cricket itself, is not a physical thing, but is rather the commonly shared possibilities of movements and engagements that congeal into rules whose boundaries the paradigmatic player shows forth. For instance, if it becomes possible for the exemplary cricketer or a small minority of them to hit sixes that are 2 kilometers in distance, then the standard boundaries of the stadium will need to be extended, or two concentric boundaries will need to be put in place. The shorter one, for instance, giving 6 runs, and the longer one giving 12 runs. This is how the paradigmatic player sets the standard boundaries of the game and sets the ground which contours the possibilities for players and stakeholders in the game. However, after setting the contours become inconspicuous and taken for granted, and retroactively seen as the natural path that cricket should have taken. This congealment of rules and the concealment of the process is what allows for immersion and engagement in the game. We must keep in mind, however, that there is nothing genuinely paradigmatic or eternal about hitting the balls harder and harder, which Tendulkar and Bradman can do. This is just one possibility of engagement that has become the dominant one through some contingency of history and now appears as natural. Hitting the game as softly as possible could equally have been the paradigmatic move in the game, which then would retroactively look natural. However, it is only by staving off attention to this contingency, that is, only by taking the congealed rules as natural, that the game itself can be played and understood. Likewise, ontotheology's function is the grounding, maintenance, and preservation of a congealment of possibilities that allow both for intelligible access and dispersal within its world. Unlike cricket, metaphysics for Heidegger congeals a structure of intelligibility through a core grounding essence, a fundamental whatness, whose contours the deity or the paradigmatic instance sets in place and justifies. Now, so far, what is sort of clear is that the ontological, the core sense of reality, and the theological, the paradigmatic instance, feed into each other. This is why Heidegger states in his 1957 essay that we have been looking at, that metaphysics, first of all, is neither only one nor the other. Rather, metaphysics is theologic because it is ontologic. It is ontologic because it is theologic. In the last few paragraphs of the essay, The Age of the World Picture, Heidegger claims that in the modern age, it is the human subject that becomes the paradigmatic being. In modernity, the human subject becomes the point upon which every being, in its way of being and its truth, is founded. Man becomes the referential center of beings as such. In another instance, Heidegger quotes the exemplary representative statement of Max Planck, the German physicist, that the real is that which can be measured. Thus, it is the calculating and measuring human subject who already sets the limits to what can count as real. However, we should be careful not to think this, even this centrality of the human, anthropomorphically. Rather, calculability, measurability, quantification themselves become both the ontological bedrock and the paradigmatic norm and the paradigmatic instance. In other words, that which is not measurable is already and in advance outside the range of possibilities allowed in an age. The measuring human subjectivity as the paradigm already and in advance determines what is an entity, which is measurable things, relations, and events, measurable relations, etc. Now, metaphysically read, this means that the ontological bedrock and the theological source and justification here combine into a single ground. Even the term norm that I have used above comes from Heidegger himself, who calls this subjectivity, this deity of the modern world, the norm-giving domain. So in such an instance, let's say indigenous non-Western science and medicine, to take an example, are at best kept outside the boundaries guided by this deity, or at worst are punished for transgressing these boundaries. So submitting an astrological calculation to a scientific journal, for instance, is not only to see it rejected at the desk, but also to put one's own reputation as a scientist at risk of punishment. This is not, however, a condemnation of science. In a different age, religious institutions like the church or the temple guarded their regimes of truth in similar ways. Heidegger is merely describing how a structure of truth is maintained and guarded, for only this way could a world for your immersion. To take a crude example, if the traffic rules of your city were not jealously and unquestioningly guarded against transgression, one couldn't immerse oneself in the activity of driving. Another arresting passage from Heidegger's 1942-43 cycle of lectures on Parmenides, which might be the earliest instance of his formulation of metaphysics as ontotheology, runs in this way. The true is that which, on various grounds, is self-asserting, remains above and comes from above. That is, it is the command. But the above, the highest, and the Lord of Lordship may appear in different forms. For Christianity, the Lord is God. The Lord is also reason for another age. The Lord is the world spirit. The Lord is will to power, for Nietzsche, for example. Metaphysics is then the hegemonic grounding and securing of a structure of intelligibility to the point of self-evidence, so that Dasein can seamlessly disperse itself in its world. This takes us to the important question of what metaphysical ontotheology aims to accomplish. Why does metaphysics shape an age ontologically and theologically? Yuri Shrivers, in his text Ontotheological Turnings, claims that metaphysical ontotheology is a shuddering before contingency. Bringing up contingency as the essential subject matter in the study of ontotheology implicates us into core Heideggerian concepts like singularity and the event. Metaphysics, with the deity having entered and settled in it, is an elaborate means of foreclosing and staving off these ways of understanding being. To understand this further, we move in the next section to the relation between being and the historical nature of metaphysical grounding. In stating this, we must keep in mind that for Heidegger, a metaphysical grounding stabilizes an age for a temporary period. It is precisely this failure to permanently stabilize the grounds of an epoch that makes history itself possible for Heidegger, making failure a constitutive feature of Heidegger's notion of history or Geschichte. The third section. Heidegger's account of metaphysical ontotheology is historical. Since Being and Time, Heidegger makes a stark distinction between historiology, which is the scientific study of facts from the past, and history, which he sees as the very destiny and movement of being itself. In discussing the history of metaphysics and in engaging with its destruction or deconstruction, Heidegger's concern is with history as Geschichte. It is on this history, which charts the very movement of successive understandings of truth and intelligibility, that the scientific study of past events, historiology, is founded. In fact, in the later Heidegger, this history of successive understandings of our core intelligibility is called epochal history. Two passages from Heidegger can better illustrate this Geschichte dimension that is essential to his study of metaphysics. The first passage, in his Being and Time, Heidegger claims, regarding his own project of destruction or deconstruction of the history of Western ontology, that we can carry out this destruction only with regard to stages of that history which are in principle decisive. So the concern of this history is with those revolutionary epochal scissions that punctuate and transform what things and their relations ultimately mean and how they concern us. In the second passage, from his 1962 address titled On Time and Being, he clarifies the connection between the question of being and that of history and clarifies the use of the term epochal. He states, to hold back in Greek is epoche. Here we speak of the epochs of the destiny of being. Hence we speak of the epochs of the destiny of being. Epoch does not mean here a span of time, but rather the fundamental characteristic of sending, the actual holding back of itself in favor of the discernibility of the gift of being with regard to the grounding of beings. Now let us unpack this passage. An epoch is a particular delimited and temporary ground of intelligibility on the basis of which all intelligibility is structured or configured. For Heidegger, this is the sense of being which all previous metaphysics has forgotten to think and question about. Being shows itself as a ground of intelligibility, while refusing and holding in reserve other possibilities and means of grounding meaning. To ask again at this stage, what is being? For Heidegger here, being is not itself an entity, but is essentially a term of excess, which always remains withdrawn in all stable and concrete grounding of entities, keeping these worlds brimming with other possibilities of grounding. in this essay, Heidegger considers being in terms of the abundance of transformation, which gets charted in metaphysics as the idea or ousia, energia, substantia, and so on and so forth. Right? These are the sort of the lords that we saw. These are the paradigmatic instances which contour the possibility of truth within an epoch. Okay, but this is how being sends itself to metaphysics. But at the same time, every epoch, a being also withdraws itself in a particular epoch, withdrawing the other excess possibilities. He additionally states the development of the abundance of transformation of being looks like a history of being. But being does not have a history in the way in which a city or a people have a history, where he goes on to essentially make that distinction between history as Geschichte and history as Historie, as scientific study of past events. Being as this abundance gives itself as a particular ground which metaphysics secures. However, this giving is at the same time a refusal, a withdrawal, because other excessive possibilities of grounding are bracketed or parenthesized, which is what epoche means. Epoche, going all the way back to Husserl, epoche in the phenomenological tradition means parenthesis. And being as a particular ground that metaphysics uses is, sorry, I lost my electricity here. So epoche means parenthesis, to keep in parenthesis. These other possibilities do not, however, exist somewhere outside, but are immanent to the very structure of intelligibility. This immanent riveness and potential otherwiseability of structures of meaning is the giving-refusing structure of being for Heidegger. Metaphysics, when it claims to have captured being, must in fact fail to capture the otherwise possibilities which being simultaneously withdraws. So when being is captured by metaphysics as a particular ground, all these other possibilities of grounding are bracketed or kept in parenthesis. This giving withdrawing or giving refusing of ground is termed by Heidegger as Ungrund or unground. And he uses this first in his 1935 text, The Introduction to Metaphysics. Heidegger scholar Ian Thompson contrasts Ungrund both with Urgrund as the eternal foundation imagined by metaphysics, and he contrasts this also with Abgrund as sheer anarchic flux. Let us go back to our example from cricket. The game will have an Ungrund, a stable ground, which is, however, not an eternal ground, when a Tendulkar or a Bradman are conceived as the paradigmatic instances that set the very contours of possibility of a game like cricket. And yet, as we have seen, there is nothing naturally necessary about Tendulkar or Bradman and their skills which determines them as paradigmatic. Thus, cricket has an Ungrund. It has a stable foundation, but not an Urgrund, which perceives its ground as necessary, eternal, and unmovable, like the god of theism. The Ungrund is also distinct from the Abgrund. For the game to function as a game, or for Dasein to immerse itself in a world, we cannot do away with the congealment and stabilization of the game to the point of self-evident intelligibility. What we have here is a halfway point between foundationalism and anti-foundationalism. Some commentators reflect this halfway point by calling being a groundless ground. Ian Thompson reads the Ungrund as appearance of ground, which is a useful formulation, but it could give an idealistic color to the term, as though beneath the appearance of ground, there is being as a real ground, merely appearing in various, in constant variations. A better formulation that I've been proposing in my work is stasis. Stasis is a real ground, but not an eternally fixed ground. It is rather a ground that can be imminently otherwise, that always awaits after a stable period its own punctuation. Additionally, the insistence on imminent punctuations means that the actants within the structure of stasis which could include art forms, cultural and religious expressions, different world formulations, and different degrees of coincidence with their epoch, play a decisive role in pushing towards this punctuation. Thomson, who is a central authority on Heidegger and ontotheology, understands Heidegger's history as ontological historicity. He bases this on Heidegger's meaning of epoche as holding back or bracketing. He defines ontological historicity this way. Ontological historicity, in a nutshell, is the thesis that our basic sense of reality changes with time. As for epoche, he understands this as ontotheology's task of temporarily shielding a particular sense of what is and what matters from the corrosive sands of time, from the corrosive sands of history. Using another evocative phrase, he states, each of the epochal understandings of the being of entities holds back the floodwaters of ontological historicity for a time. Right? So the parenthesis is trying to hold back this excess of other possibilities so that one particular ground can be stabilized for a while. It is important to note that ontotheology metaphysics actually, cannot fully and forever hold back the floodwaters of other historical possibilities. In my understanding, this failure to hold back is not a flaw or a limitation, but is precisely the historical dimension of ontological historicity. Therefore, what has been crucial for us in this discussion of the grounding of the intelligibility of an epoch is the central role of failure. Ontological historicity is historical precisely because metaphysics fails to thoroughly ground, once and for all, the structure of intelligibility of an epoch. If Plato's forms, which both function as the ontological bedrock and paradigmatic instance, were to stabilize and ground the intelligibility of an epoch once and for all, leaving, as it were, no chinks in the armor, then there would be no meaning to history at all. No meaning to history in the Geschichte sense. It is only because this grounding and founding inevitably fail to fully totalize that we have here the thickness of history. However, there is a paradoxical element to this failure. Heidegger's central claim all along, since his early texts in the 20s to his late texts in the 60s, is that metaphysics fundamentally fails to raise the question concerning being. What does this failure mean now that we have gone through what metaphysics means? It means that metaphysics conceives of being as Urground instead of conceiving of this ground as Unground, or as stasis immanently containing its otherwiseability. However, paradoxically, it is only because metaphysics must necessarily fail to see being in terms of unground that being can give itself as ground while simultaneously withdrawing itself. Now for the last very short section, failure as revealing. In the previous section on metaphysics and failure, we looked at the structure of metaphysics as ontotheology and the role of failure in the history of metaphysics. In this section, we shall be looking at failure as revelation of the contours of Dasein's world. Heidegger's famous tool analysis in Being and Time precisely points to this revelatory character of failure. The analysis explores how it is with the breakdown of a system that the contours of the system become conspicuous. Dasein, in its everyday activity as a being inhabiting a world of concerns, does not have to stop and look at the things around it to establish their meanings and reality. The world in which Dasein moves is already settled, already grounded in its intelligibility through dominant systems of knowledge and dominant norms of behavior. The mechanics of how this happens, we have already seen in detail in the previous sections. Dasein finds itself thrown into a structure of meaning. As a finite entity, Dasein finds itself inheriting a certain tradition of understanding and certain norms of behavior. There are institutions that regulate and guard these norms. It is this endowment that allows Dasein to go about its activity with circumspection. This is what allows it to open a door, for example, without even looking at the handle, or push the brake without stopping to think about the mechanics of automobile acceleration. However, Dasein's everyday activities always contain possibilities of failure, of breakdown, of misplacements. Section 14 of Being in Time introduces the famous example of the hammer. For Dasein to seamlessly engage in the task of hammering, of using the hammer itself must withdraw. It must become inconspicuous. You can see in some ways the parallel with how being with its excess must withdraw so that a particular ground can be sustained. As he puts it, as Heidegger puts it, the peculiarity of what is proximally ready to hand, that is, what is handy, is that it must, as it were, withdraw in order to be handy quite authentically. However, when the handling of the hammer fails, when there is a breakdown in the system of tool use, the hammer stands before us obstinately conspicuous. Not only does the hammer, but the whole network of equipment that forms the work world of Dasein lights up. The world announces itself, to quote Heidegger, when an assignment has been disturbed. When something is unusable for some purpose, then the assignment becomes explicit. The totality of our circumspective dealings in the world is lit up as a totality constantly cited beforehand. And this is the announcement of the world. So when the engagement with the world breaks, the world for a moment appears as the world in which we are immersed. Thus, it is with the collapse of a system that the contours of the system itself becomes explicit. The tool analysis is only an example of wider ways in which Dasein's world can shatter, making the world itself come to presence. In fact, when the contours of the world are brought to light, Dasein's inauthentic commitment to the world is lost. The fascinated immersion in the world is halted. This halt, which failure gives us, this halt gives Dasein the opportunity to stand face to face with its thrown condition, with the inherently contingent and historical nature of the grounds of its world. It gives Dasein the opportunity to see the structure of intelligibility and the network of concerns that constitutes its being in the world as grounded groundlessly. When Dasein encounters the collapse of its world, other possibilities of worlding become imaginable. Failure has the power to reveal other possibilities, to show the world as otherwiseable. I wish to conclude my remarks with a reflection on what I like to call the failure of failure in Perumal Murugan's novel, Paya. The novel tells the story of the love and marriage between Kumaresan and Saroja, who belong to two different castes. With exquisite literary skill, Murugan shows the caste-based hostility that the couple faces for flouting the caste norms of the village. This leads, through the temple council, to the excommunication of Kumaresan as a member of the village. Such an excommunication leads to the family's boycott from all exchange, including that of water, grains, and grazing land. The marriage causes intense anxiety, both to the village and to Kumaresan's single mother. Throughout the novel, his mother, Marie, is shown as muttering curses and recriminations against her son and her new daughter-in-law. The whole second half of the novel is the story of the village coming together, led in fact by Marie, to extinguish this relationship and this marriage, which they all agree has brought to them ill fortune. One of the most touching scenes in the novel is Kumaresan's appeal to his mother, which he makes in the name of love. Does she not love him? He asks her. Does she not want what is best for him? Why then would she be so obstinate in her opposition? And why should the village council, the village temple, its annual festivities, and the uncharted norms have such a hold on her? Of course, as the novel shows, this appeal is to no avail. The normative structure that configures this world does not leave a chink in its armor. As Saroja realizes, though this village is in the middle of nowhere, without protected walls and guarded gates, not even a foreign wind can enter its world. The tragedy of this story is that the norms and conventions that guard this space, that configure and contour it, resist failing. They resist breakdown. And because this normative structure resists breakdown, it never conspicuously shows itself to Marie and others. It does not reveal that it is a particular normative structure, hiding in it otherwise possibilities. By the last chapter of the novel, the punctuation or the tear in the fabric of its normativity, which this marriage represents, is anxiously swallowed up through an act of violence. This is how a decisive encounter across this world's normative borders is averted. An encounter that could have brought to light other ways of being in the world, thereby offering the opportunity for the world itself to light up and announce itself. And we end with a footnote. Heidegger's ultimate fear, is not Kumarason's village, which, for all its obstinacy, at least offers the possibility of a world-shattering encounter across its wall-less borders. His major fear is the modern epoch of global technology, of global technological mastery and capitalist accumulation. Kumarason's village at least has a frame which can be crossed and thus be seen as a frame. For Heidegger, the age of technology represents what Michael Marder has called frameless unframing, which in its framelessness incorporates and preempts every other possibility of revealing. In this way, it is anxious to make failure itself impossible, incorporating it as part of its own system of functioning. Thank you for listening. So that's the end of the paper.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Iyer, for this very, very interesting and very rich paper. There's plenty of food for thought here, too much perhaps. Just to flag 2-3 points very quickly. This is a very fascinating way of looking at Heidegger via, as you say, the lens of failure, and to use failure as a way of exploring both the limitations of traditional metaphysics as well as the various kinds of openings that are possible via those limitations. What I particularly found interesting was the way you connected it with ontotheology, that there is a certain exemplary figure via which worlds are opened up, as it were. And in this sense, even science has an exemplariness. The figure of the human being as the calculating calculator, as it were. And this perhaps brings, I thought, Heidegger into contact even with Edmund Husserl, who thinks of Galileo as having the biggest sort of impact of limitation via modern science. And besides, the whole dimension of modern science and the figure of God in modern science, in the sense of deifying, I think via ontotheology you also brought up towards the end, at least I saw the connection between technology as a way of engaging with engaging with absolutism. Let me put it in this manner. So an absolutism that in a way disallows failure, and because it disallows failure, does it disallow the exploration of possibilities itself? Now, my very quick concern. So this is a very important, I think, argument which I have sketched in a very superficial way here. The nuances are there in your presentation, and there are plenty of others who will be having questions for this. Let me not abuse the chair. Okay, I have a temptation to ask just now, but let me not abuse my position, and let me open this to the wider audience who have been listening for a discussion.
Can I just say one thing, ma'am? Thank you very much for this. I really liked this statement that you made, that in a sense, the disallowance of failure as the disallowance of exploration of possibilities. I think that seems to be the main sort of problem that Heidegger seems to have with technology, global technology. So in his question concerning technology essay, Heidegger would say how the technological mode of revealing forecloses every other mode of revealing. And there is this interesting passage in an earlier text of his, which he a lecture which he delivered at Bremen, which is like a precursor to his technology essay, where he states very interestingly that, and he talks about the machine, and his main focus is on the machine, where he says that machine technology incorporates its very failure as part of its success. So, I mean, that's his major fear. And so that it leaves no danger of a collapse, which can allow other ways to move forward, as it were. So, yeah, that's...
That's really, really very interesting. But let's move on. Thank you for that addition and that clarification. Several, I request you, there is a hand that has been raised. Sabdashwas Chakrabarti, please ask your question. There are a couple of comments by Dilip Bhattacharya on the screen. We'll come to that. But let Sadapsha ask the question, please.
Thank you, Professor Mahadevan. Thank you, Bharatwaj. Fantastic to listen to you. I just have I think it's just this one question, can have multiple ways of expressing it. But like when you were like making this point about failure very central, I was just wondering, can we really find some kind of a very like a little like a strict understanding of how this failure comes about in systems, in structures, in modes of thought, in different inquiries? Because I think this is where Heidegger keeps it very open. I mean, it almost appears like himself sort of essentializes failure itself. Like, I mean, because failures, and I think it connects very well to the last example, like the point you made with reference to the novel, where there is a failure of failure itself. But then I think that emerges precisely because we don't have an account of failure. And that is why we are not able to understand when failure fails. Exactly. So in terms of this epoche and how, obviously this, I mean, basically we can, the way you illustrated it was fantastic. Perhaps it just, you're saying we focus on one thing. I mean, one particular mode of intelligibility helps us to focus on one thing, and as if just like the camera focuses on something and things recede to the background, as if there's a blurring effect that happens. But the thing is, the things in the background are always still there. They do not like vanish. They are there, but and they can at any time become important events. The focus can again shift to those images. So the same way, perhaps this happens. But then failure, I mean, just your comments on this. Maybe you can give a more causal account of failure itself.
Yes, that's it's really a very excellent question, because it in a way goes to the heart of aspects of Heidegger that are sometimes problematic, but also sometimes they can be deployed in interesting ways, even if they are problematic. One is Heidegger seems to, like you're saying, Heidegger doesn't give us an account of a failure in the same way that Heidegger doesn't give us an account of how a contingent shift happens from one epoch to the other, because he is able to constantly let being do the work here. Like being withdraws, so there is there's a new contingent shift. So somehow it's being's business to do, and then there is this sort of quasi mysticism about being itself in Heidegger. These problems are related to the question of failure as well. So he neither gives an account of failure, nor does he tell us descriptively how failure happens. However, so this is a problematic aspect in Heidegger. So almost making, in a way, politics impossible. There is no how do we make a shift? We don't know. It can only wait for being to do it. So there is that implicit quietism. Is that related to his political past? I mean, there's a lot of debate about these questions. But one interesting thing is that because Heidegger is trying to think other than metaphysically, so that he can think about the conditions of metaphysics, he seems to avoid causal explanations. Because if he wants to save contingency, and if he wants to, if he does not want failure to be predetermined, teleological, then he will have to leave this to a certain historical punctuation which happens contingently. And if it happens contingently, the full force of contingency would require that a causal explanation cannot be kind of given. It cannot be pre-programmed. Heidegger does this not only with failure, he does this all the time. For example, in his discussion on technology, in his 53 essay, Heidegger will say that we cannot overcome technology because that itself is a technological project for him. What we can do is there is of course poetry, but it appears as if there is a lot of waiting for events to take place. So for example, in his interview to Spiegel, he says that only a God can save us, for example. So there is this waiting of a punctuation. So, but if that punctuation has to be genuinely contingent, we cannot entirely hold him for account for not pre-programming that failure, and therefore not elaborating on its causal roots or causal grounds. So this is a very interesting question, but I think it goes sort of both ways. There is an element to this, I feel, which comes from a certain quietism on Heidegger's part, that he's not able to commit to a political project or to an ethical project. He cannot think about how a system can collapse, how to bring it about. For example, a system, an oppressive system like caste system, for example, how to make it fair. He does not allow us any insight on that. But at the same time, it appears that what is saving in this, what can be redeployed for other purposes, is that he's trying to save contingency maximally, and that might require him to forego causal explanation. So this seems to me go ahead. Yeah.
Perhaps, I mean, one account of failure, like it's present in the passages that you quoted, is in the tool analysis as well, perhaps, and it's not very adequate, is the functionalist kind of very purposive kind of failure. So how do we know something, the failure is finally arrived, is when something breaks down. So breaks down in what sense? In the sense that it's not able to perform its designated functions anymore. But then that is obviously not adequate, right? Because this kind of functionalist reading of anything, of history, of ontology, it's not adequate. So I think that's also, I mean, I agree with what.
And also, it does not take into account. Sorry.
Yeah, you could just answer very briefly, because there would be,
sure.
I'm sure, several others who have questions. Sorry to be so.
No. Yeah.
No, definitely.
Yeah.
Cut and dry.
Just one sentence. And ma'am is right. Not only is this is the account of failure only related to functional failure, but there's also nothing about normative failure of norms, of political. I mean, none of that is there in the functionalist account. But I think we can develop it. There is resources for that in the text. So thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. The normative failure, I think you have illustrated in the Perumal Murugan discussion, but we can talk about it. Dilip Bhattacharya has a question, a couple of them actually. He has a comment and a question. In a sense, his metaphysics is successful for making Dasein understand the world. And so this metaphysics project is successful because it contributes to understanding. And what are the philosophical implications of your paper? So you could briefly, because there are others, I think those who wish to ask questions, please put on the chat box or raise your hand.
Metaphysics succeeds to the extent that it can stabilize a world, and in which Dasein can immerse itself. To that extent, obviously, yes, metaphysics to that extent is successful. But this is a very paradoxical kind of success, in that this is a success for a certain period of time. And by period of time, what he has in mind is this success is not in itself necessary success. It's a contingent contingent event that has emerged. So there is no reason why one metaphysical structure should override another. For example, he's very explicit about that. For example, in one of his very late lectures, he talks about how all these metaphysical, so he's talking about how in our technological age, can we go back and find some resources in Plotinus, and can we, so he suggests how all these metaphysical systems are none is better than the other, because the purpose that they're serving is the stabilizing of a world for Dasein's immersion. To that extent, yes, metaphysics is successful, but it's also implicated in its own failures, which is why metaphysics is also historical. That one particular metaphysical system is not forever. It changes and punctuates across history. So that's the first. That's my comments on the first question. Second, I think it's an important question, is what are the philosophical implications of this research? I think the paper on failure, and then also the largely ontological account in which I base this. To me, the most important thing to keep in mind, for me, which Heidegger does not talk about enough, but I think can be brought out from Heidegger, is the political and the normative, and how this account of failure can help us to think about how Heidegger can be thought along with norms, with law, with ethical projects, and so on. That is one implication. Another thing that it's not there in this paper, but which I'm working on as part of my thesis work, is how can other traditions of metaphysics be thought along with this. So we are largely speaking about a very Western history, and it appears as if so how can this be thought along with non-Western histories of thought? And the way I think about it is, I ask, is every system of thought around the world metaphysical in the ontotheological sense? Is it trying to ground a certain structure of meaning for Dasein to immerse in? My answer is yes. And if that is the answer, that means that the solution to the global crisis, which for Heidegger can only come from the West, because the West has caused the problem, so only the West can in some ways answer the problem, give the solution. But if other traditions of thought also are metaphysical in that sense, which Heidegger denies, for Heidegger only the West is metaphysical. But if other traditions of thought are also engaged in a similar project, which Western metaphysics is engaged in, then those traditions of thought also have a say in the question of how to think about our present condition, our present problems. So, I mean, those are some of the sort of philosophical implications of my work. And there's another implication could be that there is an interesting philosophical field, not a field, but I mean, there is now an interesting philosophy of failure. To which there can be a sort of Heideggerian contribution. So yeah, those are some of the sort of implications of my.
Thank you so much. Shafi has a question. Yeah, please go ahead.
Hello, Bharatwaj.
Yeah, hi. We can hear you.
Yeah. It's a truly wonderful paper. I really like the way you wrote it, and I appreciate the metaphors you used in some places very strategically. and it was aesthetically very pleasing to, as you know, I was listening to it in a paddy field actually in the evening time. So in the last climax section, it was like hitting it. I was actually feeling that thrownness, you know.
We are
So,
so jealous of you.
We are jealous of you
You are
indeed.
sitting here in an urban area, surrounded
oh,
by
really?
pollution. We are in the
Oh.
midst of pollution. Yeah.
Yeah, that was going through my mind. The example of the hammer, you know, and the moment the hammer becomes inconspicuous. Yeah. Anyway, there are a lot of things that you put. So I know it's a very limited time and very little time for discussion. Anyway, I thought the way you try to conceptualize everything into the idea of failure is very interesting, and that particularly struck me very deep, because I am also working in a similar mode of thinking where, you know, I am working with Butler, and I am trying to deploy Butler's methodology of performativity into understanding the subjectivity of the artist. Okay, so also I believe that this can be deployed to understand any mode of subjectivity. And interestingly, Butler also talks about the constitutive failure. Maybe you must be knowing that. And the constitutive ambivalence. Yeah, it's, I don't know if it is directly directly implicate with Heidegger's thought, but anyway, to become a particular subject, the process involves an objection of what it is not, and the congealed identity is actually a sedimentation through a historical, you know, process, and not a natural a priori thing, and it holds the possibility of failure in it. So that's every performative act holds this possibility of failure in it. So it can be, you know, it can be a freedom at the same time. It is, you know, it doesn't make the subject a natural, you know, conclusive subject. So that this failure allows it to, you know, create subversive potentials and possibilities. Yeah. So also, I'm just commenting. I'm not, you know, directly asking you anything. I'm just commenting. And also, I think the notion of failure is like very rampant and central to all post-structural thinking's thoughts. I think in Freud also, unconscious, you know, reveals that the conscious subject is a myth, and, you know, human aspiration to conceive truth in a totality is a failure. And Derrida also talks about, you know, that failure, that in his notion of difference, that the world cannot be understood, cannot be comprehended through a totality. Every kind of these thinkers are against this, you know, metaphysics, which is always tethered to the notion of truth, and reveals that, you know, metaphysics is not just about, you know, this the notion of God or, you know, totality, but it is happening whenever we utter or try to talk about any object in the world. It is a kind of the process of metaphysics happens there. Whenever we talk about any object in the world, it is logocentric. So, so that kind of, you know, understanding is, you know, the core of all post-structural thoughts, I think. And in many thinkers deploy it in a very specialized way according to their own, you know, preferences. So it's interesting, this notion of failure and the way you put it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And it was such a rich set of comments. I'm really happy to receive this. And I'm going to go back to constitutive failure and see how I can think with Heidegger about that. One point about Freud. It's just randomly, I just thought about this when you were talking. So there is this Freudian psychoanalyst called Adam Phillips who reads Freud's reading of Hamlet. And
Oh.
one of the things that he points out is that the problem with Hamlet, the tragedy of Hamlet, is that his interpretation does not fail. In the sense, his interpretation of the events of his life, including the murder of his father, and uh, the interpretation is too successful in that it is too firm. And and so Adam Phillips says that interpretation should be constant because it should constantly fail. So you need to constantly reinterpret. And he uses a notion in Freud called overinterpretation. Says that the problem with Hamlet is that he doesn't overinterpret because he's too much of a successful interpreter in the first. So it's
Yeah.
just a thought. I mean, it just struck me when you.
Yeah, I know. We can also think about what is happening, the current situation of, what goes on in the world, where people are stuck with this interpretation, that fixed interpretation about the world,
Yes.
and not being able to experience the thrownness in their own
Exactly.
possibility. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, there is some good news. We can go on till 7:45. This is what I gather from Dr. Mani Madhavan. So very grateful. So we can have some more questions. And I'm sorry that I was so sharp in cutting you off. Apologies for that. So maybe more questions can come. In the meantime, there are a couple of appreciations that Mr. Iyer can note on the chat box from Dr. William Sweet and Govert Schuler, who would like to have a workshop with you.
Oh.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, Govert Schuler, please go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, hi. We can hear you. We can hear.
Yeah, I got just two questions. I want to know, when there are no ultimate, actually there is no ultimate answer to the causal question, the question of cause. In either science or in philosophy, how can one say one particular metaphysical view is a failure? That's the first question. Second question is, can we draw any parallels between Heidegger's interpretation of logos and with the concept of Brahma in Indian philosophy? Because he says that logos is what human beings are.
Thank you, Nirmala. Actually, I thought Govert Schuler would be asking the question, but you can ask immediately after this. Sorry about that. Thank you, Nirmala, for your question. So maybe you can attend to this and then we'll come to Govert Schuler.
Okay, so the first question is, if there is no ultimate, then how can any be a failure? I think the one way to sort of answer that would be to, in a way, reverse that, to say that given that there is no ultimate answer, this means that no metaphysical solution will be an ultimate solution or an ultimate success. So that it's not like a metaphysical perspective is false. Heidegger is not saying that. He's expressly denying that position. But he's saying that none is the ultimate, none is a final position, which then would require no further no further historical movement of truth. So he's saying that given that there is no ultimate answer, then no particular philosophical position is an ultimate success. So it contains, it fails to finally ground. That's what he's saying. As to logos and Brahman, I'll have to think about that. Although,
Hello, just a minute.
yes,
I was asking you why you found the Heidegger's view a failure. Not Heidegger. Not about Heidegger. Why you are finding it a failure?
Okay. I'm not it's a it's a pretty very interesting question. What I was saying there is, even Heidegger cannot completely chart the final thing. I mean, given that Sabdashwa, for example, was raising, I mean, there's so many things that Heidegger overlooks, so many things that he so many blind spots that he has, even on things like how can we even think about failure in the normative ethical sense. I mean, he has hardly anything to offer there. So the point is rather not that he failed, but that he is not complete or he's not final. So he is just one particular way in which we can think about this. Very important way, but very important thinker to do that. But ultimately, like all thinkers, like all metaphysical systems, he falls short. So that would be my my answer.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Logos and Brahman, I'll think about. There's one thing that I thought about the Brahman Maya distinction when Ian Thompson says that. So he phrases it this way, not with this in mind. He just says that for Heidegger, metaphysics looks at metaphysics takes a certain certain ground, a particular ground, as the ground of a structure of meaning. Now, to metaphysics, Thompson says this appears as a final ground. So there is a kind of these various historical grounds appear to metaphysics as the eternal ground. So I was just thinking. I mean, when I was reading, I just had a thought. Okay, is this like the Brahman Maya? Maybe that could be a way to think about those questions. But I have to work on it further to see how that can.
Okay, thank you.
Am I audible?
Yeah, now we can hear you. Now
Yes.
we can.
Yeah. So another quick question that I initially thought, but I thought there was less time to ask, so I didn't think of posing it. It is when I was listening to your like this description of how of theology and the way numerous different scholars have illustrated it with so many fantastic examples. I was just thinking about your use and selection of this particular word, paradigmatic. I don't know if this is relevant, but just because I work, I mean, with structuralism, with psychoanalysis a little bit. So, I mean, can we say that ontotheology and the rules, the norm basis, and then the exemplar, the theos, and then the ontological basis, the two of them sort of somehow are they analogous to the syntagmatic and the paradigmatic in Saussure, or let's say the synchronic and the diachronic? I mean, just your thoughts on this.
I have to go back to those thinkers. Before saying no, I'll have to think about that. I've written. I'll be writing down the question, but I'll have.
May I intervene? Wouldn't it be more along the synchronic lines than the diachronic? Because he's critical of causal determinisms and the whole idea of thinking of history as a set of facts and so forth. So, and the very idea of historical epoch as being a kind of a withdrawal, rather than something that is, although he uses the term unfolding, something that is presented. Let me use the word presented. Something that is presented from a pre-given potential and so forth. So wouldn't that be a more synchronic perspective? And also thinking about Foucault and his roots in Heideggerian thought,
What would be? Could you repeat about the pre-given possibilities? What were you saying? There is a. Or did I mishear you? You were saying that there are pre-given possibilities.
Did you ask me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that there is something like a potential that is already given, which is very determinate, from which everything unfolds.
Right.
or presents itself, let's put it,
Okay.
something that develops. So rather than development, it's the opposite that is happening. In a way, it is the lack of development
It's more like
in the profound sense of the term that Heidegger is concerned about, isn't it?
the
That
cuts
is,
and punctuations that
yeah,
are the leap of one epoch to the other.
yeah. So that is what you are focused on. So from this point of view, I was saying. But
Uh,
Govard Schuller has this question. Can we look into the examples Heidegger himself gives, energy, substance, measurement, and look for a pattern of epochs?
Yeah, I think we could. I mean, because I mean, for example, for Heidegger, being in its movement cannot show itself as it is, because it is in a sense a withdrawing phenomenon. So the place that Heidegger goes to see this is the history of metaphysics. And so the history of metaphysics for him is a kind of screen on which this can be looked at, which you can look at this. This is also why I think he is also very Hegelian in a certain sense, in that to him, the overcoming of metaphysics can only happen at the end of metaphysics, after the unfolding of metaphysics has taken place. So then only sort of the owl of Minerva can spread its wings. So because for Heidegger, only after the development has taken place, only after metaphysics has in some sense completed itself, exhausted itself, then you can retrospectively look back and see the pattern of this giving withdrawing structure of being. Given that structure, given this, yes, definitely, all these particular terms through which metaphysics has tried to ground meaning can become interesting patterns for thinking about this epochal manifestation of being. But also another question can be raised as to, okay, given that these are specifically Western moments, can you do something likewise in the history of philosophy in a different tradition, say in India? How can we think about this? So I think it can be, because for Heidegger, the development of metaphysics and the terms that metaphysics has been using through its history gives a sort of template. A different tradition might have a different template. So we can do this in a different tradition as well. Although some scholars would say that has metaphysics completed itself, exhausted itself in the same sense as Heidegger claims it has in the West, all the way down to technology and nihilism and so on? Has that happened in other traditions of thought? And so there is that interesting debate which can take place. But yeah, I think these can be seen as patterns. I think so.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think we'll have to wind up because we've got some 4 minutes left and we have a vote of thanks. Okay. This has been an excellent discussion, and maybe the scholars who want to discuss it further can reach out to Mr. Iyer later on. But very quickly, in the context of some of the questions that Sabdashwa Chakravarti had brought up, I was curious about just one thing, but this can be discussed later. Just like failure is a kind of there is almost a tendency to think, as you said, he put it in an interesting way, of failure as a kind of an essentialization. Now, does this parallel a similar essentialization of death in a way, in the Being and Time, something that Hannah Arendt critiqued him and started thinking about natality.
Yes.
Let's note that for Heidegger, death is in a way the opening up of possibilities, just as failure is an opening up of possibilities. So in a way, these are some of the key ways, key notions that we might want to engage in when we are looking at metaphysics from the perspective of finitude. Just a thought, we could discuss it further. Many thanks to everyone. You want to respond to it in just a quick line?
It's not an answer because the question is really very interesting, as I told Sabdashwa as well. I mean, it's a very rich question. Your question is also very rich in that, I mean, doesn't that pose the same question? One interesting thing is that Heidegger distinguishes demise and death, or biological death, and death as the as a certain kind of world collapse, as the collapse of all the sum total of the projects of Dasein. So in a way, as we were saying, that failure can induce this world collapse, which brings the world into view. The same function can also be served by death. So there is already a similarity between failure and death. That doesn't answer the question, but it's just to say that there is that similarity, so that the question becomes more interesting to look at. But I have to look at that. I have to get back on that. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Yeah, that's fascinating, and I thank the team at the Global Forum for Young Philosophers for having this session, this very, very interesting session with this fabulous discussion that has been so thorough and that is inexhaustible, it would seem. So we just take it ahead in terms of email correspondence and so forth. I also thank Dr. Bala Murli for his very kind words, Dr. Srikala Nair, Dr. Shimi. However, there is one point I wish to make, a qualification, a correction, that I'm not the head of department anymore. I'm just a professor there. So thank you so much, and all the best, and wonderful audience as well.
Thank you.
Many thanks, Professor Mahadevan and Dr. Iyer, for this wonderful session.
Hello, Bharatwaj. Thank you so very much for this lecture. On behalf of the Global Forum for Young Philosophers, I would like to thank you for taking out time and uh, putting on a show, really, because there was so much to gather and so much to take forward from this lecture. I want to thank also Dr. Kanchana ma'am for taking out time and uh, introducing the theme.
Last but not least, Professor Srikala Nair, who has been the leading light for this forum. She is the one who conceptualized this, and she is the one who's leading the discussions in this forum. So thank you so much, ma'am. And thank all the professors and students for taking out time and being part of this meeting. Thank you again, and see you in the next session in the coming month.